Coming up on The World Today, violence, looting characterized the protests going on in the United States over the killing of George Floyd, not to mention a total disregard for social distancing. Countries continued easing lockdown restrictions as global COVID-19 figures remain on the rise. And schools are reopened in the UK, but parents still wary of releasing their awards. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Amarachi Ubani. Over the next half hour, we'll be taking you through major stories of the day. We begin in the United States, where violence has been ruling the streets of major cities as protests spread to more cities over the killing of African-American George Floyd. Curfews have been imposed in nearly 40 cities, but people have largely ignored them, leading to tense standoffs.
The protests turned violent in several cities across the United States, despite the curfews. Police vehicles were set on fire and shops looted. According to the National Guard, 5,000 of its personnel were activated in 15 states and Washington, D.C., where crowds once again gathered near the White House, this time lighting fires and throwing stones at riot officers. Riot officers continued to respond Sunday night using tear gas and flash grenades. At least 4,400 people have been arrested over several days of protests, according to a tally by the Associated Press.
It was literally just a few seconds before we went live.
The offenses range from looting and blocking motorways to breaking curfew. Even on Monday, the rage persisted. They have even taken an unexpected twist, with police joining in some instances. Police officers have been taking a knee and joining in the marches to show solidarity with protesters demanding justice for George Floyd. Some others have joined protesters in the streets calling for change. President Trump has condemned Floyd's killing, but he has also described some of the current protesters as thugs. George Floyd was arrested the evening of Monday, May the 25th, after police received a phone call from a neighborhood grocery store alleging he had paid with a counterfeit $20 note. Officers were attempting to put him in a police vehicle when he dropped to the ground, telling them he was claustrophobic. Police say he resisted officers and was handcuffed. The officer, who had his knee on Floyd's neck while he kept saying, "I can't breathe" and "don't kill me," has been arrested, and his appearance in court pushed to the 8th of June.
The VOA's Jessamine Oni joins us now. She's in Washington. Jessamine, thank you for joining us on the program. Talk to us about how those protests are going on today. Are they still as violent even in Washington?
Well, it's still early here in Washington. What we've seen with the protests since the video went viral is that demonstrators start gathering a little later towards the day, so about an hour, a couple of hours from now, and then they turn violent after the sun goes down. So it's a bit early to say how today and tonight will look. What we can say is that what we've seen in the past 6 to 7 days now is that these protests have completely intensified, and there is no saying when we are going to see a pause, a cooling down, or an end to this.
So let's just do some revision. There was a protest near the White House yesterday, and the president had to be briefly put in a bunker. Do we understand what the protesters near the White House hope to achieve with threatening the White House, apparently?
Well, it doesn't seem like they were trying to get inside the White House. I think a lot of these protests have been to get attention nationwide, and I saw it in the package. A lot of attention has been given to the violence and the looting. But just as we are seeing across the nation, and as we saw at the White House yesterday, a lot of these demonstrations actually start out very peaceful. What they want is social justice, and they're speaking against police brutality, which they feel has been occurring in this community, in this nation for decades upon decades, and it has just blown up since this video went viral.
Let's talk about the policemen who were seen joining the protest, some of them holding posters, some also chanted along with the crowd. How does this reflect on the police generally in light of the reason why the protests are holding in the first place?
Yes, we've seen police officers not just joining in with the protest, but some even taking a knee. The chief of the district, the department that this all started with, actually went to the site where Floyd was pinned down, and he, took a moment of silence, got on his knees. And so we're seeing that across the nation. We're seeing a lot of law enforcement coming out against the initial incident and what that officer, Derek Chauvin, did. But we are also seeing that in some cases, that the situation, the incidents have become so violent, and police departments are also being criticized for being heavy-handed in their response to some of these protesters.
Now, speaking of the heavy-handedness, some members of the press have been caught up, in some of this heavy-handedness. A reporter, I think, with the NBC or MSNBC, I think, had a rubber bullet hit her eye, and now she's permanently blind in one eye. It appears the press is getting caught up in the protests. Some of them also, being arrested and taking direct hit from the police. Is it difficult to tell who's a journalist and who is not, who's a protester in the protests? Are these really innocent mistakes the police is making?
Well, we can't speak to the intent, and I certainly can't speak to how things get chaotic. I think some instances have been very clear that these are reporters, like the arrest that you mentioned of the CNN reporter. I can say for our organization, we've been told to display our press passes as prominently as we can to stand out. Of course, there is no saying what will happen, and a lot of these officers are also individuals, and it's very hard to read how they will respond and react to people they see in the crowd.
Justice Cement, thank you again for speaking with us on The World Today.
Thank you.
So let's stay with the protests just for a minute. The fired Minneapolis police officer, Derek Chauvin, who had his knee on George Floyd's neck in the footage, which has gone viral now, we understand has been transferred to a maximum security jail where he awaits his first court appearance for third-degree murder and manslaughter. The Minnesota Correctional Facility at Oak Park Heights is a third jail that Chauvin has been moved to since his arrest on Friday. He's been transferred first to prevent the spread of COVID-19 at the Hennepin County Jail, where he was previously taken and kept before an expected influx of protesters at that jail. He's also got bail set at $500,000. The protests are against racism and police brutality, two issues that have got celebrities talking in the United States, celebrities across the world, I should say. People like Beyonce posting a video on Instagram calling for justice for George Floyd. Ariana Grande was spotted at a protest holding a Black Lives Matter sign. And some actions from representatives of government, such as Kentucky Governor and Andy Beshear, who has announced an investigation into a man who was killed when both police and protesters exchanged gunfire in Louisville. Violence accompanying the protests have been condemned by George Floyd's younger brother, Terrence. He told ABC News earlier, "I'm outraged too. Sometimes I get angry. I want to go crazy. My brother wasn't about that." You'll hear a lot of people saying he was a gentle giant. Today, he went to the site in Minneapolis where his brother was last seen alive to let people know, he said, just channel your anger elsewhere. His words on the issue. So the protests are also going on in other parts of the world. In New Zealand, people are chanting Black Lives Matter. In the UK, there are thousands gathered across London, some holding signs saying justice for George Floyd. In Canada, where large protests held in Vancouver and Windsor, they're also protesting against the killing of George Floyd, as well as in Germany. President Donald Trump has described the protesters who are going violent across the U.S. as anarchists. A Democratic presidential hopeful, Joe Biden, says the U.S. is a nation in pain, which they must not allow to destroy them. Let's talk to Channels TV's Washington correspondent Maria Bird. She joins us now. Maria, I'm glad that you're safe. The president has been expected to speak sooner. People had been expecting him to say words of comfort, help to douse the tension in the country. What impact have his words had so far on the protests?
Unfortunately, many people believe that his words have potentially incited more violence. People are so angry. They're looking, as you said, for those words of comfort. And I think that people are asking, where is the president stand? Where does he stand on this issue? Yes, he has come out and said a few words and saying that, the killing is not right. But again, it's that compassion. And I think so many people are hurting. As we've mentioned time and time again, you're dealing with a pandemic. You're dealing with an economic crisis. 40 million people are out of work, and a Black man has been killed. And as I've talked before on your show for a couple years now about the Black Lives Matter movement, and more importantly, the lives of African Americans that are being taken senselessly and oftentimes by the police.
Sad indeed. But I also want to talk about the Floyd family. They have conducted themselves quite well, through all of the chaos. And how they're processing this. I'm sure they never expected the protest to turn violent. There are two sides, of course, to the story why the protests are violent, but it appears everyone wants to be part of the protest somehow, whether it's online or in person. What does this say about how Americans really feel about racism and police brutality?
Well, the Floyd family, as you mentioned with the brother, they're asking for people not to tear down the communities. Again, tearing down the communities. There was a woman, elderly woman in a wheelchair saying, where am I going to go to the store now that my community stores have been burned down? And so they're asking for peace. If you think about Dr. Martin Luther King and all of those civil rights leaders of the 50s and 60s, they were talking about the issue of hatred. And that is what we must focus on. We must remove the era of hatred and focus more on how do we move past this and move to peace. And so I think that's when you look at the Floyd family, they're asking for peace because, as you said, they said their brother was a gentle giant. And so when you talk about someone that has a heart, and this is really a matter of the heart, but when you put so many things together, it does enrage people. And the question is, how do we get past the rage and move toward justice?
Indeed. And one police officer, the one who had his knee on Floyd's neck, has been charged with murder. But there were 3 others who were seen in that video. Has there been any word on these other officers?
The country is calling for, and as we talk about the protest, the question is, the protesters are saying, when are they going to be called forth? When are they too going to be charged? And so, that once that day happens, I think we will begin to see some subsiding of the rage. But at this time, the Attorney General's office, they said they're still investigating and they still have not brought forth the charges. And again, there's the laws that relate to how police are charged are very different than the everyday person. And so oftentimes the semantics of the laws give police officers sometimes ability to have a longer process and oftentimes not even being charged. And so they're hopeful, again, that they will see some justice for those who are standing by and watching this horrific occasion for George Floyd.
And indeed, Maria, and I think the protests across the United States are also reflective of how people across the world feel about police brutality, even here in Nigeria. Thanks again, Maria, and do stay safe.
Thank you.
Stay with us in the world today, still ahead. We have more on the coronavirus outbreak, plus you get a chance to see the Vatican museums with no crowds as they reopen after the lockdown. Stay with us. Welcome back to The World Today. Lockdown restrictions are easing across Europe and across the world. In the UK, schools are reopening for the first time in 10 weeks because of the coronavirus pandemic. Many parents, however, intend to keep their children at home a little longer over fears the country is being reopened too fast. The easing of strict measures will mean classes will restart for some younger children. Up to 6 people can meet outside in England, outdoor markets can reopen, and elite competitive sport can resume without spectators. Ministers have been wrestling with how to kickstart the economy, which has been devastated by the lockdown, to curb the spread of COVID-19 while avoiding a possible second wave of infections, which would cause further damage. The government says relaxing the restrictions starting today represents only a limiting easing, but there has been concerns that the country is still not ready for the changes and that more people are beginning to ignore guidelines on social distancing. Channels Television's London correspondent Juliana Olayinka joins us now. Juliana, great to see you. So those schools are reopening because they've been closed for about 10 weeks. It's a lifetime, I guess, in the eyes of a child. You'd think that kids would be really eager to go back, and you think the parents would be eager to also have their kids back in school, but that's not the case, right?
Good afternoon, Amarachi. No, it isn't the case. Sadly, I think it's more on the case of parents than it is children. There are about 2 million of them that were supposed to go back to school today, as you said, after 10 weeks of being at home, driving their parents wild. But according to some of the recent statistics, Britain is the most coronaphobia country in the West. And that's a proven point, considering that we know only 1 million children went back to the school gates. These were children in reception year 1 and year 6, which is children between the ages 4 and 5, and children who are 10 going on to higher learning. One of the major concerns really is whether or not it's safe. And a lot of these parents just feel as if, children running around catching germs isn't going to be good enough. Although we do know that it's highly unlikely that children catching coronavirus will be fatal, of course, when they get home, bringing it back to their parents could deem otherwise. So unfortunately, not many children back at the school gates today.
Yeah, and today the country begins to reopen. What does that mean? Because the government still says it is there's still a partial, this is a partial easing of restrictions. Explain that to us, Juliana.
Well, what it means is that not everything is open. The famous streets of Oxford Street and Regent Street aren't exactly jam-packed. But Prime Minister Boris Johnson knows that he must get the economy turning again, considering it's costing the government about £15 billion a month, while people decide to stay at home. So what we're seeing now, apart from those essential workers and those who cannot work going back to work, we've also seen today the opening of car showrooms, outdoor markets, so where people typically would buy their fruit and veg and some other bits and pieces. They've started to reopen. And of course, schools. The school run is one of the main reasons why Britain does have traffic in the morning. So things are starting to get busier. I was in the studio very early this morning, and there was crowds on the street.
Yeah. And Juliana, very quickly, your kids excited to go back to school?
They are excited. Me and my husband are very excited. And it's interesting, actually, Amarachi, both of my children, I've got 3, but both of them actually fall into the category of being able to go to school. So, yes, we're very happy to send them off with their backpack this morning.
Well, best of luck then. Thanks again, Juliana.
Thank you.
Well, we're still looking at the coronavirus pandemic across major cities around the world, which are beginning to ease restrictions imposed to curb spread of the coronavirus. Citizens do remain eager to get back to their normal lives. This comes as global confirmed infection rates of novel coronavirus disease is reaching approximately 6 million. It reached approximately 6 million on Sunday. A global death toll, however, is gradually nearing 400,000.
The easing of lockdown restrictions began today in Britain as the government allowed many stores to reopen for the first time since March.
That's right.
In addition, up to 6 people can now meet outside, outdoor markets can reopen, competitive sports can resume without spectators, and more than 2 million of the most vulnerable will now be allowed to spend time outdoors. Over in Russia, residents of Moscow can leave their homes to take a stroll for the first time in 9 weeks under a partial easing of tough lockdown measures following a fall in coronavirus cases. Shopping centers and most parks, all of which have been fenced off for weeks, can also reopen from today. In Turkey, the Grand Bazaar, cafes and flights, gyms, swimming pools, beaches, parks, libraries and museums today resumed as the country eases restrictions. Shop owners say they have completed necessary preparations and looking forward to welcoming customers from abroad. Thousands of employees returned to work today as the Philippines' capital of Manila eased lockdown restrictions. Residents of the Southeast Asian nation's capital spent 11 weeks under lockdown, longer than the 76-day quarantine in the Chinese city of Wuhan, the global epicenter of the virus. And the ease of restrictions in South Africa also means that liquor stores opened as queues built up outside drink shops in Johannesburg. The stores are only open for limited hours as the country continues to revive its stuttering economy with the partial lifting of the lockdown, letting people out for work, worship or shopping, and allowing mines and factories to run at full capacity. There is no lifting of restrictions for some other countries still suffering health-wise from COVID-19. Chile reported that more than 1,000 people have died from the virus in the country, with 827 of the deaths occurring in the month of May alone, as the pandemic spreads quickly in the South American mining powerhouse. Meanwhile, in Mexico, the health ministry says the death toll from the coronavirus has risen beyond 9,300, with over 90,600 cases.
As we end the program, the Vatican Museums reopened its majestic doors today, ending a 3-month closure caused by the coronavirus lockdown. In pre-coronavirus days, there was always a long line of tourists waiting patiently to enter these stunning museums, which house some of the world's greatest Renaissance masterpieces, as well as ancient Roman and Egyptian artifacts. But with borders still closed and movement around Italy banned, it was Romans on Monday who queued up in big numbers to take advantage of having the museums to themselves for once. In order to control the number of people inside for social distancing reasons, the museums can also only be visited by making online reservations. And that's the world today. Thanks for watching. I am Amarachi Ubani.